The summer air was thick with humidity, clinging to the skin like a damp warning. Rockdale, Georgia, lay quiet under the weight of another still, ordinary night. In the suburban hush, porch lights flickered, casting long shadows over neatly trimmed lawns. The scent of barbecue still lingered in the air from evening cookouts, blending with the faint hum of crickets. It was the kind of night where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen, but something did. Imani Roberson had just left her mother's house after dinner, loading two of her children into her SUV. Her other two had stayed behind with their grandmother for the night. It was a simple routine, the kind of thing she did countless times before. She was supposed to drive home, tuck her kids into bed, and settle in for another exhausting but fulfilling night as a mother, except she never made it home. The first calls went unanswered. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Maybe she was tired, had fallen asleep early, her phone left charging on the nightstand. But as the night stretched on, the unease grew. Calls went to voicemail, texts remained unread. Her mother, Clarine, sat awake, staring at the glowing screen of her phone, willing her daughter to respond. She told herself there had to be an explanation, something simple. By morning, that illusion shattered. Clarine got in her car and drove to Imani's house. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, its quiet streets lined with houses that stood in serene stillness. The air was thick with summer heat, pressing down like an omen. She rang the doorbell and waited. No answer. She knocked harder this time. The silence behind the door gnawed at her. She tried the handle. It turned easily. Inside, the air was stale, undisturbed. The living room was neat, the couch cushions arranged just as they had been the last time she visited. The kitchen counter held a few dishes, remnants of a normal day. Everything looked in place. But something was wrong. Imani wasn't there. Her purse sat on the table. Her shoes, the ones she wore every day, were still neatly placed by the door. Her phone, her ever-present link to the world, lay abandoned on the nightstand. The things she would never leave without were all there, untouched. Her car was gone. A chill ran through Clarine, despite the heavy warmth of the room. Imani was a mother of four. She wouldn't just leave, not like this. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling. "My daughter is missing," she told the 911 dispatcher. Her voice cracked under the weight of the words. Something's wrong. The questions came. Was she known to leave without notice? Had she mentioned any plans? Could she be with a friend? She wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't leave her kids like this. By the time the first patrol car pulled into the driveway, Clarine's fear had solidified into something cold and certain. She stood outside, watching as officers stepped into the house, taking in the stillness, the eerie lack of disturbance. They moved through the rooms, noting the absence of struggle, the untouched belongings. It didn't look like a crime scene, but mothers know when something is wrong. Another car pulled up. Tires crunched over gravel as a man stepped out, his movements slow, deliberate. Donald Anderson, Imani's husband. His face was unreadable as he approached, his gaze flicking to the officers, then to Clarine, who met him with an unspoken demand for answers. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice measured, careful. "She's missing," Clarine said, her breath tight in her chest. "Where is she, Donald?" A flicker of something crossed his face, surprise or something else. It was gone before she could name it. "I don't know," he said. "She left last night." Clarine's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Left and went where?" He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "We argued. She said she needed some space, got in her car and drove off." One of the officers took out a notepad. "When exactly did you last see her?" "Last night," Donald repeated. His voice didn't waver. "She left on her own." The officer glanced toward the house. "She left without her phone?" A pause. Not long, but just enough to notice. "Yeah," Donald said. "Guess she forgot it." The officer scribbled something down. A woman leaving in the middle of the night, without her phone, without any of her personal belongings? That didn't make sense. The officer's gaze flicked toward Donald again. "Did she say where she was going?" "No." Clarine's stomach twisted. Something about the way he was speaking, the way he stood there, too still, too controlled, made her insides churn. The officers finished their notes and assured her they would start looking into it. As they walked back toward their car, Donald turned toward his own vehicle, gripping the steering wheel just a little too tightly. Clarine watched him drive off. A whisper of something cold settled in her chest. She didn't trust him, and deep down she feared that Imani would never walk through that front door again. What she didn't know was that, at that very moment, miles away, Imani's car was already burned beyond recognition, abandoned in a secluded stretch of forest. And the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The morning heat had begun to rise, turning the already humid air into something thick and oppressive. It was the kind of heat that clung to the skin, made every breath feel heavier. But inside Imani's house, it was a different kind of weight, one that settled into the bones, a suffocating stillness that had nothing to do with the weather. The officers moved slowly, their eyes scanning the interior with practiced precision. They took in the undisturbed furniture, the neatness of the space, the eerie absence of movement. Nothing about the scene screamed struggle. There were no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, no obvious signs of forced entry. It was a home frozen in time, as if its owner had simply stepped out for a moment and forgotten to return. But there were details that didn't sit right. The half-drunk glass of water on the counter, the untouched pile of laundry, the phone on the nightstand, its screen dark but charged, waiting for someone to pick it up. Women didn't leave their phones behind, especially not mothers. Outside, Clarine stood near the patrol car, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The worry on her face had deepened into something else now, something darker. A mother's intuition was rarely wrong, and hers was screaming at her. The officer who had spoken with Donald scribbled a few more notes in his pad. They had gone through the standard checklist: missing persons report, last known whereabouts, recent behavior. They had asked about arguments, stressors, any signs that Imani had been planning to leave on her own. Nothing pointed to that possibility, but a missing persons case wasn't the same as a crime. Not yet. That meant there were rules to follow. They couldn't force their way into something bigger without cause. They needed evidence, a reason to believe this was more than just a woman walking away from her life. Still, there was something about it, the kind of feeling that settled in the gut, low and uneasy. It was the way the house seemed too quiet, the way Donald had answered questions with just a little too much control, the way Clarine's fear was steady and unwavering. Hours passed and there was no sign of Imani. Calls were made. Friends, family, neighbors. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. The day stretched on, the sun climbing high before beginning its slow descent. The unease spread, crawling into the minds of those who had known her, those who had seen her just the day before, full of life, full of plans, full of things left unfinished. It was the uncertainty that was the worst part, the not knowing, the waiting, the endless possibilities, each one worse than the last. By evening, the police presence had dwindled. There was nothing more to be done, at least not yet, but the weight of something unspoken still lingered in the air, thick as the heat. Somewhere out there, Imani was missing, and someone knew exactly why. The sun had barely begun to rise when the search for Imani intensified. The weight of her absence settled heavier with each passing hour, turning unease into urgency. Time was no longer an abstract concept, but a ticking clock, each second pulling her further from the life she had left behind. Clarine's house became a command center of worry, with family and friends filtering in, their faces tight with concern, their voices hushed but restless. Every call made, every door knocked on, every question asked led to the same answer. Imani had simply vanished. Her sisters reached out to everyone who might have seen her, friends, co-workers, even distant acquaintances. The response was the same. No one had spoken to her since the night before. No social media updates, no text messages, no missed calls. It was as if she had stepped into thin air. The police had gone through the initial protocols, missing person reports, interviews with immediate family, a standard check of local hospitals, jails, and emergency centers. But with no sign of Imani, no clear evidence of foul play, there were limits to what they could do. She was an adult. Adults had the right to leave if they wanted to. That was the standard line, the one that made sense on paper, but it didn't make sense in reality. A mother of four didn't walk away without her phone, her wallet, or her children. A mother of four didn't disappear without telling someone where she was going. Outside, the Georgia heat pressed against the pavement, turning the streets into a shimmering mirage. The neighborhood carried on as usual, neighbors watering lawns, kids riding bikes, unaware that a woman had gone missing among them. The world had not yet caught up to the gravity of the situation. By midday, detectives had been assigned to the case. They combed through Imani's daily life, searching for a hint of something, anything that might explain where she had gone. Financial records, bank activity, cell phone data. But there was nothing. No withdrawals, no purchases, no signs of a planned departure. The absence of evidence was almost more unsettling than if there had been something obvious. It meant that whatever had happened to her had been swift, unexpected. There had been no preparation, no time to leave breadcrumbs. Then there was Donald. His version of events remained the same. They had argued. Imani had left to clear her head. That was all. There was nothing more to say. He didn't know where she had gone. He didn't know why she hadn't come back. But his demeanor was off. Grief did strange things to people. Some cried, some panicked, some withdrew. But Donald was something else entirely. He was calm, too calm. His words were measured, his reactions controlled, as if he had rehearsed them beforehand. Detectives noted the lack of concern in his voice, the absence of urgency, the way he spoke about his missing wife as if she were an inconvenience rather than a person who had disappeared without a trace. There were no flyers printed with her face, no desperate pleas to the media, no frantic phone calls from him to check on any updates. If he was worried, he didn't show it. And that, more than anything, made people start to wonder. The day stretched long, the sun dipping lower, casting elongated shadows across driveways and sidewalks. The search expanded, reaching beyond her home, beyond the familiar streets she had once driven through daily. Fields, parks, empty lots. People looked, but they found nothing. As night fell again, the truth settled over everyone like a heavy fog. Imani was gone. And the longer she stayed gone, the less likely it was that she had left by choice. The days stretched on, blending into a haze of unanswered calls, restless pacing, and growing dread. Imani had been missing long enough for the air to change, for whispers to creep into conversations. The police were still treating it as a missing person case, but to those who knew her, that label no longer fit. This wasn't a woman who had simply chosen to walk away. By now, local news stations had picked up the story. Reports described Imani as a loving mother of four, missing without explanation. Her face appeared on television screens, her smile frozen in time. The kind of photo that should have been reserved for birthdays and family albums, not for desperate searches and breaking news. Clarine barely slept. Every hour that passed without an update deepened the pit in her stomach. She had stopped hoping for a simple explanation. The truth, whatever it was, would be dark. It had to be. Then the call came. A man had been walking near a wooded area outside Atlanta when he noticed something unusual. Smoke. Not fresh, not thick, but the lingering remains of something that had burned. The air still carried the acrid scent of melted metal and scorched fabric. He had followed it, stepping carefully through the undergrowth until he saw what remained of a vehicle, charred beyond recognition. The windows shattered, the paint blistered and peeling. A hollow shell, blackened and skeletal. Police arrived within the hour, and even before they checked the VIN number, they suspected what they had found. The SUV matched the description of Imani's vehicle. White, mid-sized, the same model. Whatever had happened to her, this car had been a part of it. Inside the interior was a wasteland of ash and melted plastic. The heat had been intense enough to warp metal, to erase details, to consume nearly everything inside. But there were still things that fire couldn't take. A stain, deep in the fabric of the passenger seat. A residue that, even after flames, still hinted at something sinister. The testing would take time, but everyone already knew what it was. Blood. The location was isolated, far from any main roads, tucked away in a place where no one would have seen the fire unless they had been looking for it. Someone had wanted this car gone. They had wanted whatever was inside it to disappear. The discovery changed everything. No longer a missing person case, No longer a woman who had simply left. Imani had been taken, and now there was proof that something terrible had happened. The police returned to Donald, knocking on his door before the sun had fully risen. His expression barely changed when they told him about the car. No sharp intake of breath, no sign of panic. He listened, nodded, and simply said he didn't know what had happened. His words didn't match the moment. The officers pressed harder. If he had last seen her driving away, where had she gone? Had she contacted him since? Did he know of anyone who would have wanted to harm her? He gave the same answers as before, as if reciting them. No, she just left. No, he hadn't heard from her. No, he didn't know anything else. But his face, his posture, his voice, none of it rang true. Police already knew they would be checking his movements, tracking his steps in the days since Imani disappeared. The discovery of the car meant the investigation had shifted. There was no more waiting, no more assuming she had left by choice. Someone had done this. Someone had burned that car. And someone knew exactly where Imani was. The discovery of the burned SUV had been the first undeniable sign that something terrible had happened to Imani. It was no longer about speculation, no longer about theories. A car didn't drive itself into the woods and set itself on fire. Someone had done this. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase something, to conceal something. And blood, even in the wake of fire, still told a story. Investigators combed through the wreckage, careful not to disturb what little remained. The fire had done its job well, reducing the seats to little more than a brittle frame, the dashboard to melted remnants of plastic and metal. Yet despite the destruction, pieces of the truth clung to the ruins. In the driver's seat, the fire had been most intense, as if gasoline had been poured there deliberately, ignited with precision. It suggested more than just an attempt to destroy evidence. It suggested control. Whoever had done this had planned it. They had known where to take the car, how to ensure it burned fast and thoroughly, leaving behind as little as possible. But there were always mistakes. The blood stains that had soaked into the fabric beneath the flames had resisted complete erasure. DNA testing would take time, but it didn't need confirmation to be damning. The probability of it being Imani's was overwhelming. There were no signs of a body inside, which meant something even worse. If Imani had been in the car when she was hurt, she had been moved before the fire. It meant the burning of the SUV wasn't just about panic. It wasn't about covering up a spontaneous act of violence. It was calculated. As forensic teams processed what little evidence the fire had spared, detectives turned their attention to tracking movements, cell phone records, security footage, financial activity, anything that could place someone near that wooded area at the right time. Imani's phone had last been active in her home. It had never left. That too was telling. If she had truly left in a hurry, she would have taken it. If she had planned to disappear, there would have been some trace of her, a withdrawal, a credit card charge, a call to someone. But there was nothing. The investigation expanded. Police pulled records of Donald's phone, tracing its pings from cell towers in the hours following Imani's disappearance. They examined nearby gas stations, hoping to find footage of someone buying accelerants, of someone refueling before heading into the remote stretch of land where the SUV was found. Then a breakthrough. A security camera positioned at a small convenience store not far from the location where the car had burned had captured something. A man purchasing a red gas canister. His face was turned slightly away from the lens, but his build, his posture, the way he carried himself, it was enough to raise suspicion. Investigators ran the footage through facial recognition software, checking for matches. It wasn't an immediate hit, but it placed someone in the area at the right time. A trail was forming. Detectives revisited Donald's alibi. His story remained unchanged. Imani had left after their argument. But now, with this new evidence, the weight of his words seemed thinner, more fragile. He had no solid proof of where he had been during those crucial hours. And then, the most damning detail, his brother Sidarius Glaze had been in town. Sidarius had a history, a past that made investigators pause. He wasn't the kind of man who asked too many questions when it came to cleaning up a mess. If Donnell had needed help, if there had been a body to move, if there had been a fire to start, Sidarius was exactly the kind of person who would have known how to do it. The case was unraveling. Imani had not left on her own. Her car had not ended up in the woods by accident. And now, for the first time, there was a tangible link between suspicion and proof. The pieces were coming together, and soon someone would have to answer for them. The weight of the discovery pressed down on the investigation like a vice. The burned-out SUV had been a turning point, transforming a missing person case into something much darker. It was no longer a question of where Imani had gone, but of what had been done to her. Detectives worked tirelessly to reconstruct the missing hours between when she was last seen and when her car was set ablaze. The evidence, fragmented and scorched, painted a picture of premeditation. Someone had ensured the car was destroyed, that whatever remained inside was unrecognizable. But there were gaps, small ones, but enough to follow. The blood inside the SUV was being analyzed, but no one needed to wait for confirmation. The location where the vehicle had been abandoned was deliberate, far from prying eyes, chosen for its isolation. It had not been dumped in haste. It had been placed there with purpose. The choice of locations suggested familiarity, a knowledge of places no one would check unless they were looking for something or trying to make sure something was never found. The police revisited every recorded movement from the night Imani disappeared. Cell phone pings traced Donald's device to his home, but there were crucial gaps. Times when his phone had been powered off, locations where GPS signals had failed to register. This was another calculated move. Someone had known enough to avoid leaving an obvious digital trail, but there were ways around that. Investigators started looking at traffic cameras, gas stations, convenience stores, anywhere within a certain radius that might have captured a vehicle leaving the area. The footage from the convenience store had already raised alarms. A man purchasing gasoline, a man whose identity wasn't immediately clear, but whose build and mannerisms raised suspicions. Then came the next piece, the gas station footage. It was late at night, barely any cars on the road. The timestamp placed it within the critical window of Imani's disappearance. The image wasn't perfect, but it was enough to see a man stepping out of a dark SUV, filling a red gas canister, paying in cash. His posture was rigid, his shoulders squared. When investigators isolated the frame and ran it through their system, the result was damning. Sidarius Glaze. The name brought a shift in momentum. He wasn't just a visitor. He wasn't just an outlier in this investigation. He was Donald's brother, a man with a past, a man whose presence in town wasn't coincidental. Sidarius had been in Rockdale that night. He had been near the location where the SUV was later found. He had purchased gasoline. The implications were clear, but the challenge remained. How did it all connect? And more importantly, where was Imani? The police didn't wait to move. They tracked Sidarius down, finding him at a relative's house, his demeanor unreadable as officers approached. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't ask questions. He simply watched as they informed him they had questions about his movements the night Imani disappeared. His reaction wasn't immediate. He didn't panic, didn't argue. But there was something in his silence, something in the way his eyes flicked away from the officers for the briefest moment, as if calculating what to say next. They weren't arresting him, yet. They were building a case, threading together each piece of evidence. But Sidarius was no fool. He knew how this worked, and he knew the walls were closing in. Back at the station, detectives laid out what they had so far. A missing woman, a burned-out SUV with traces of blood, surveillance footage of Sidarius purchasing gasoline, a timeline that, when stitched together, told a chilling story. Imani hadn't vanished. She had been erased, and the men responsible were running out of places to hide. The weight of the case was shifting. The scattered pieces were beginning to take shape, each thread pulling investigators closer to a conclusion that had lurked just beyond their reach. Imani hadn't simply disappeared. She had been silenced, removed from the life she had built, and those responsible had worked carefully to make sure no trace of her remained. But fire, no matter how destructive, couldn't erase everything. The name Sidarius Glaze had changed the momentum of the investigation. He was no longer just a peripheral figure, no longer just a man who happened to be in town when his brother's wife vanished. The surveillance footage placed him at the scene in a way no alibi could explain. He had purchased the gas. He had been near the wooded area where the car had burned. His presence wasn't a coincidence. It was intentional. But why? Detectives dug into Sidarius's past, uncovering a history that painted him as a man who knew how to handle problems quietly. He had been involved in minor offenses before, petty crimes, a few fights that had gone too far, a reputation for handling things off the record when necessary. He wasn't the type to ask questions. He was the type to act. The more they examined him, the more they realized how convenient his presence in town had been. He had arrived just before Imani vanished. He had left shortly after the car was burned. His involvement wasn't just suspected, it was certain. But Sidarius wasn't the center of this story. He was a piece of it, a tool used in something bigger. That led them back to Donald. His alibi, weak from the start, had begun to collapse under scrutiny. The last person to see Imani alive. The man who claimed she left on her own. The husband whose reaction to her disappearance had been cold, detached. He had never pleaded for her return, never begged for answers. Instead, he had distanced himself, offering only the bare minimum in cooperation. They traced his movements in the days following Imani's disappearance. There were gaps in his timeline, moments where his phone had been off, locations that didn't align with his statements. Financial records showed no major transactions, no hotel stays, no sign that he had tried to leave town. He wasn't running, he wasn't hiding. He was simply waiting, watching as the story unfolded. But the walls were closing in. Detectives knew they needed more than a suspicion. They needed something undeniable, something that would break the case open and force the truth into the light. That's when the forensic results came back. The blood found inside the burned SUV was a match to Imani Roberson. The confirmation was like a gunshot in the silent tension of the case. It was no longer just a missing persons investigation. It was no longer about looking for someone who had disappeared. This was murder, and now there was no turning back. Law enforcement moved quickly, their strategy shifting. Sidarius was the weak link. He had been caught on camera. He had been placed near the crime scene. He had been involved in the cover-up. That made him vulnerable. They brought him in again, this time with evidence in their hands. His posture was different now, his silence heavier. He could feel the weight of what was coming, could see that the time for evasion was running out. The room was cold, the walls bare. A single table, a single chair, no distractions, no way out. Sidarius wasn't a man who folded easily. He had been in worse situations, had learned how to keep his mouth shut. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about what he had done. The detectives laid it out for him. The footage, the gas can, the burned car, the blood. It was no longer a question of whether he was involved. It was a question of how much. The silence stretched between them, then a breath, a shift in his expression, a flicker of something, regret, fear, hesitation. And in that moment, they knew. He was going to break. The air inside the interrogation room was thick with tension. The walls, bare and unyielding, seemed to press in on Sidarius Glaze as he sat there, staring at the table. The weight of the evidence against him had shifted the balance. He had walked in with his usual guarded composure, but now under the harsh glare of the truth, his silence felt more like hesitation than defiance. Detectives didn't rush him. They let the room do its work, let the pressure build. The blood in the burned SUV had changed everything. There was no longer a way to pretend that Imani had simply walked away. Someone had hurt her. Someone had made sure her car would never tell the full story. And Sidarius, whether he had committed the act himself or just helped cover it up, was tangled in it. The forensic reports lay on the table in front of him. The photographs of the vehicle, the grainy footage from the gas station, the timeline that placed him exactly where he shouldn't have been. Every piece of it led to one conclusion. He knew what had happened. The police didn't expect a full confession, at least not immediately. Men like Sidarius didn't give in easily, but they didn't need him to admit everything. They just needed a crack, a single slip, a moment of weakness. It started small, a shift in his breathing, the way his eyes flicked toward the photos but refused to settle on them. His hands, normally still, now flexed against his thighs. The weight of it was getting to him, creeping into the spaces between his silence. Investigators laid it out carefully. The gas purchase, the timestamp, the location where the SUV was found. They weren't asking him if he was involved. They were asking how much. They gave him options, painted two pictures. In one, he was the mastermind, the one who had planned it, executed it, ensured that Imani would never be found. In the other, he was just an accomplice, someone who had been called in to help after the fact, someone who had been told to dispose of the evidence. One option carried a heavier consequence than the other. One of them would bury him. The other might give him a way out. The silence stretched, then finally a breath. A single movement, his fingers tapping lightly against the metal table. It was almost imperceptible, but to the detectives it was everything. It meant he was thinking. It meant he was deciding. Sidarius wasn't the kind of man who carried guilt easily, but he understood survival. He understood when a situation had turned. And right now, sitting in this room, staring at the proof that had been built against him, he knew one thing. Donald wasn't in this chair. He was. Loyalty only stretched so far when the walls closed in. Then came the first real shift, a clearing of his throat, a subtle adjustment in his posture, a sign that he was considering his next move, weighing the consequences of staying silent versus speaking. Detectives didn't push. They let the gravity of the situation settle, let him feel the weight of the inevitable. And finally, after a long, suffocating pause, Sidarius leaned back slightly in his chair. His exhale was slow, measured. It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was close. Outside the room, the wheels were already turning. The moment Sidarius spoke, really spoke, everything would change. Because what he knew, what he had done, would bring them one step closer to the truth. And that truth, buried beneath fire and silence, was waiting to be unearthed. The moment Sidarius exhaled, something shifted in the room. It wasn't just in his posture or the way his fingers finally stilled against the table. It was the way the air felt, heavy with the knowledge that he was on the edge of something irreversible. He knew it, and so did the detectives watching him. He had spent his life operating in the shadows, a man who understood the power of silence, the weight of unspoken agreements. But silence only worked when there was an escape route. And here, in this room, surrounded by evidence that pointed directly at him, there were no exits left. The tension crackled in the pause before his next move. A subtle, nearly imperceptible glance at the door, a flicker of thought as if weighing his options. The problem was, he didn't have any. The detectives had played it well, letting him sit with the truth rather than force it out of him. They had placed the pieces in front of him, given him the space to realize what he was up against. And now, with nowhere else to turn, he had one decision to make: protect Donald or protect himself. He ran a hand over his face, slow and deliberate. His breathing was steady, but there was something else there now: resignation. The first crack in the wall he had built around himself. Outside, the evidence was piling up. The forensic team had been working relentlessly, testing the blood from the SUV, analyzing microscopic details that fire hadn't been able to erase. They had matched it to Imani, of course, but there was something else too. Another sample, smaller, nearly lost in the wreckage. Not Imani's. It was the kind of discovery that detectives live for, the unexpected detail that turned a case on its head. It wasn't enough to confirm who it belonged to, but it was enough to suggest that someone else had been there, someone who hadn't intended to leave a trace but had anyway. That changed things. Inside the interrogation room, Sidarius didn't know about the new evidence yet, but something in him must have sensed it. The inevitable was creeping in, the knowledge that the longer he held out, the worse it would get. And then, finally, the first fracture in his silence. It wasn't a confession, not outright, but it was a shift. A small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a deep inhale, the kind of thing that told seasoned investigators that they had him. Sidarius wasn't the kind of man to break easily, but he was smart enough to know when he was cornered. They let the silence stretch, waiting, letting him come to his own conclusion. The tension in the room had reached its peak. The next words out of his mouth would change everything. And when they finally came, low and weighted, they were enough. Enough to turn suspicion into certainty. Enough to shift the focus. Enough to move the case one step closer to uncovering the truth about what had happened to Imani. The dam had cracked, and soon the flood would come. The pressure inside the interrogation room had reached its peak. Sidarius sat rigid, his shoulders squared, his jaw clenched. His silence had carried him this far, but the weight of what he was holding back was becoming unbearable. It was no longer just about protecting himself. It was about deciding which way the tide would pull him, towards survival or self-destruction. Outside the station, the pieces of the case continued to sharpen. The forensic team had isolated the second blood sample from the burned SUV, carefully running it through the system, cross-referencing it against criminal databases and personal DNA records. The process was meticulous, but detectives knew it was only a matter of time before they had a name. Sidarius didn't know that yet. What he did know was that his own name was now etched into the case, whether he liked it or not. The security footage, the gas purchase, the timeline, none of it was coincidental. None of it was explainable in a way that would make him look like an innocent bystander. But he wasn't the only one with something to lose. Donald's name had not yet been spoken in the interrogation room, but it lingered like an unspoken curse. The detectives hadn't needed to bring it up. They had allowed Sidarius to feel it creeping in on its own, as if it were waiting just behind him, breathing down his neck. The problem with cover-ups wasn't just the crime itself. It was the afterward. The weight of knowing that someone else's secret had become your own burden to carry. Sidarius had carried that weight long enough. His fingers twitched against the surface of the table. His leg bounced once beneath the chair. These weren't the mannerisms of a man in control. These were the cracks forming, the internal war reaching its final, inevitable conclusion. Outside, detectives gathered, watching through the surveillance feed. They didn't need to speak to each other to know what they were seeing. This was the moment before the dam broke, the moment before everything unraveled. And then a knock on the door. A forensic analyst entered, handing over a folder. One of the detectives flipped it open, eyes scanning the results before locking onto a single devastating fact. The second blood sample from the burned SUV had a match. Not Sidarius, not Imani, Donald Anderson. The world inside that room shifted in an instant. Sidarius didn't know exactly what had changed, but he could feel it. The way the energy in the room thickened, the way the detectives straightened, their silence turning into something new. He had spent years reading people, understanding shifts in power, and now sitting there, surrounded by the slow, deliberate turn of the case against someone else, he saw it clearly. They didn't need him to confess to burning the car anymore. They didn't even need him to admit he had helped, because they had something better. They had Donald's blood. That meant one thing. Donald had been inside that car. Donald had bled inside that car. And now Sidarius wasn't just a suspect. He was a witness. The silence in the room had never felt heavier, but this time, it was Sidarius who broke it, not with words, but with a slow, resigned exhale. A man who knew he had reached the edge of the abyss, and that the only way out was down. The room was still, a tension so thick it pressed against the walls, settling into the cracks between each breath. Sidarius Glaze sat motionless, staring at the table, his fingers flexing slightly against the cool surface. The weight of what he had carried for weeks, the secret wrapped around his throat like a noose, was now moments away from being released. He had spent his life knowing when to hold his tongue, knowing when silence was a form of survival. But this wasn't like the other times. This wasn't a crime that could be brushed aside, a mistake that could be cleaned up. This was different. This was murder. And the body was still out there, waiting to be found. The detectives knew it too. They could see it in the way he held himself, the way his jaw tightened, the way his chest rose just a little too slowly, like the air itself had thickened. He was right on the edge. And when men like him reached the edge, there were only two choices: fall or jump. Then finally a breath, a slow, drawn-out exhale. And then the words came. It was Donald. The name sliced through the silence like a blade. There was no hesitation, no attempt to shield his brother from what was coming. Sidarius wasn't loyal to Donald anymore. That loyalty had burned up in the fire, just like the SUV. He told them everything. The fight had started in the house, hours after Imani returned home from her mother's. She had been growing distant, making plans that didn't include Donald. He had felt it, the way she was slipping through his fingers, The way control was no longer his to wield. That was what the argument was really about. Not just words, not just anger. It was power, and Donald was losing his grip on it. But Imani wasn't afraid that night. Not at first. She had fought back, stood her ground. She had told him she was done, that she was leaving, that she wasn't going to be controlled anymore. And that was when it happened. The first blow had come fast, hard, knocking her backward. A moment of stunned silence before the reality of what was happening set in. She tried to get away, tried to shield herself, but Donald was already too far gone. The rage had taken over. This wasn't about love. This wasn't even about the argument anymore. This was about ensuring she couldn't leave him, because men like Donald didn't let go. The struggle had moved from the living room to the hallway, from the hallway to the bedroom. She had fought him every step of the way, but he was stronger. And then, the last strike, the one that took her down completely, a blow to the head, the kind that made the body go limp, the kind that left no room for second chances. Donald had stood there for a long time afterward, staring at her, waiting for her to move. But she never did. She was already gone. That was when he called Sidarius. The phone had rung in the middle of the night, his brother's voice low and tight, telling him he needed help, telling him to come now, no questions. And Sidarius, without thinking, had gone. By the time he arrived, Imani was already wrapped in a blanket, her body still on the floor. The house was eerily quiet. The weight of what Donald had done hung in the air, pressing against Sidarius the moment he stepped inside. He had seen things before, had dealt with problems before. But this was different. This was something that couldn't be undone. But there was no turning back. They had moved her to the SUV, driving her out into the night, searching for a place where no one would ever find her. The woods, remote and dark, had become her final resting place. Sidarius had helped bury her, his hands moving on autopilot, his mind shutting down as dirt covered the only proof of what had happened. Then came the fire. Burning the SUV hadn't just been about destroying evidence. It had been about erasing her entirely, about making sure there was no connection between Donald and the crime. But mistakes had been made. Blood had remained. Evidence had survived. And now, sitting in this room, Sidarius knew that Donald's fate was sealed. He had just signed his brother's death warrant. The police didn't wait. Within the hour, they moved on Donald, surrounding his house, their presence undeniable. The world outside was quiet, the suburban streets unaware that justice was about to crash through a front door. Donald had been expecting it. That much was clear from the way he stood when they entered, his expression already blank, his hands at his sides. There was no outburst, no denial, no attempt to run. Just the slow, steady realization that Sidarius had spoken. The cuffs clicked shut. The case had broken wide open. But the fight wasn't over. The courtroom was packed. Imani's family sat in silent grief, her mother clutching a framed photo of the daughter she would never hold again. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out every detail: the blood in the SUV, the security footage, the gas station receipt, the burial site, and Sidarius. He took the stand, his voice steady but cold, recounting the night in full detail. He had cut a deal, of course, lesser charges in exchange for his testimony, but no one cared about him. All eyes were on Donald. He sat there emotionless, as every detail of his crime was dragged into the light. The jury didn't deliberate long. Guilty. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The weight of the verdict rippled through the courtroom, the final crushing blow in a case that had shattered so many lives. But for Imani's family, it was only the beginning of their grief. No sentence, no punishment could bring her back. Her children would grow up without her. Her mother would never hear her voice again. And Donald, the man who claimed to love her, would never see freedom again. Justice had been served, but the scars would last forever. Long after the trial, Imani's absence still filled the spaces she once occupied. Her children still reached for her in the dark. Her mother still set the table for 5 before catching herself. Justice had come, but it hadn't saved her. It never could. Donnell was locked away. But what good was a life sentence when the real punishment had already been served the night Imani took her last breath? Because the tragedy wasn't just her death. It was the silence before it, the warnings ignored, the fear she carried alone, the hesitation that stole her last chance to run. And that's what lingers, not just Imani's loss, but the question no one wants to ask. How many times have we seen the signs and looked away? Because this wasn't the first time, and somewhere right now, it's happening again. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.